Hello, everybody. If I could grab your attention, it's literally a full house, so apologies for rushing you all to sit down. But I wanted to make sure we get as much packed into the allotted time as possible. So sorry for rushing you to sit down. Don't forget that we've got people watching online as well. So hello, everyone in the room and whoever is watching online. I'm Ryan Heath, the political editor at Politico Europe, and you are joining the third in Politico's series of great debates for this 2019 EU election season. You'll be pleased to know that tonight's discussions will live on as two separate EU Confidential podcast episodes over the coming 2 weeks, so keep an eye out for them. And I would also like to thank our partner, the European Gaming and Betting Association, EGBA, for making this event possible. Not only that, they have been presenting our National Election Playbook series and our EU Election Snapshot weekly newsletter. So if you haven't signed up for those, you can go to politico.eu/registration and you'll get them for free in your inbox each week. Now, tonight's event, we're going to split it into two parts. The first is a head-to-head debate between Sandro Gozzi from Emmanuel Macron's movement, Renaissance, La République en Marche. I'm not sure how you prefer to be known, Sandro, but that's who you're representing, the case for EU integration, the case for more EU. And facing off against him is Anders Vistesen, who is MEP already for the Danish People's Party, which has just joined the new alliance that Matteo Salvini is heading, that will be appearing at the EU elections and in possibly many more European Parliament seats after that. And he'll be making the case for why we don't need so much, or possibly not any EU at all. Before we get started, I want to point out that Garance Pinault, who is a member of the Politico 28 class of 2019, she's very sorry she couldn't be here tonight. That does mean we have an all-male panel, but if we're going to have an all-male panel, we're glad that Sandro Gozzi is going to fill her seat. But she is very deeply sorry she can't be there. And after the first session, and before the drinks party that we all invite you to outside, we will have a second panel. That's where we'll have three different perspectives, not facing off, but complementing and contrasting each other. We're going to introduce those speakers later on, but you'll hear from the betting markets, from the journalism world, and from the opinion polling expert world, and what they bring to the table for understanding and predicting what's going to happen in the elections next month. Now, of course, it's a dynamic Politico event, so I want you all out there tweeting and putting your questions forward online. You can use the hashtag EUDecides. And if you also look on the hashtag EUDecides, even if you don't want to say anything at all, we will run two different polls to test your levels of Euroscepticism and interest in EU reform. So look for the poll there, and we'll let you know the results of what everyone watching was thinking about those two issues. But before we head into the debate, I would like to welcome up onto stage our partner, Henrik Tjärnström, the CEO of the Kindred Group, on behalf of the European Gaming and Betting Association, for a few welcome remarks. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Ryan. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to be here at the capital of Europe, and especially on a day like today with a very important summit taking place literally next door. I don't think it could be a more appropriate backdrop to discuss the case for and against EU. And also thank you to Politico for organizing this important and timely debate, and also giving me and inviting me the opportunity to come here and share some of my thoughts with you. And I will try to keep myself brief. In just a few weeks, the EU citizens will make their ways to the ballot box and elect their representatives to the European Parliament. But we live in a time when the common union is being questioned in quite a few member states. The question I ask in today's interconnected world, is being part of a union or a common market really optional? I will try to give my view on this through three fundamental trends. The first one being the digital revolution, the second one about the consumer power, and the third one about sustainable regulations. The first trend I want to address is the digital revolution. I represent a company that is sprung out of the digital revolution a bit over 20 years ago. Kindred, born as Unibet back in 1997, is now one of Europe's leading digital companies with multi-billion euro turnover and also over 20 million customers across Europe. At Kindred, we saw an opportunity in the rise of internet and the benefits of a common single market where all EU citizens could enjoy the same products as their neighbors. Our purpose has always been to give our customers a better, fairer, and a safer online gambling experience driven by technology. And like many other disruptors in society who came before us, we too have tried to, or had to upset vested interests and monopolies along the way. Of course, it's not always been easy, but some must question the old habits, because without market disruptors, nothing will change, and it will be to the detriment of the consumers. The digital revolution offers us all an enormous new opportunities, greater access to new information, new products and services. But this new reality also creates new challenges and responsibilities, not least for those companies who provide their services online. And as consumers put great trust in the online world, regulators and companies operating in this realm have to have an even greater responsibility to protect this trust. And that brings me on to the second trend. In today's borderless internet society, consumers have more power than ever before because the next offer is just one click away. Nobody knows this better than retailers of today. And I'm sure that many of you in this room have searched the internet to find a cheaper product or offer on sites such as Amazon or Booking.com. And why pay more than you have to do? The EU has always been a strong advocate for consumers through the single market. And when we talk about the case for and against the EU, the single market is surely EU's greatest success story. But it needs to work better, particularly for online consumers. That's why I'm particularly pleased that the European Council recently concluded that digital single market rules needs to be more efficient and better enforced, and barriers should be removed. I could not agree more. Adapting the single market for the online world is crucial because it shouldn't matter if a consumer buys a book or a plane ticket or places a bet online. That customer should always enjoy the same rules, standards, and protections regardless of which country they live in. And that's currently not the case for many online sectors, including my own. And that brings me on to the final point and trend. Regulation needs to be adapted to the new realities. Policies should nurture the new consumer-driven reality and not hinder it. We live in a globalized and technology-driven society, and policies must be closer aligned with consumer behavior. The EU has to an extent led the way in regulating this new reality through the groundbreaking GDPR, and by enforcing breaches on competition and tax laws from large tech giants, and by breaking up inefficient and harmful monopolies. This is good for the consumer. But digital companies also need to understand that with their roles comes responsibilities to society. And to conclude, the EU is based on the notion that all citizens are equal and should enjoy the same standards. This should also be the case for all sectors, including online gambling. And that is why we're calling for a common set of rules across the EU for our sector, putting the consumer at the center, based on the highest standards and efficient regulations, which offers consumers safe protection and rights regardless of where they live. For this reason, we urge the new Commission and Parliament to play a leading role in adapting the single market to the new digital reality and for the benefit of all Europe's citizens and consumers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, it's time to invite up our first debating panel onto the stage. Sandro Gozzi, I'm going to invite you up first. Let's give him a round of applause. And Anders Vistesen, let's give him a round of applause as well. Now we're just going straight to the heart of what a lot of people want to know, which is how strong the Eurosceptics are going to be. If there's one thing people ask me as an outsider or as a non-EU expert, they want to know, are the Eurosceptics taking over? So let's be contrary and start with you first, Sandro. You're the president of the Union of European Federalists. You wrote a book called Generation Erasmus. So lay it out for us in 60 seconds. Why do we need more Europe?
Well, we need more Europe because the world has changed, because there are so many transnational issues about which national policies and national politics is totally powerless. And this, by the way, is one of the reasons of the crisis of national democracy and politics. And we need to develop a new governance at European level on transnational issues such as migration, fight against climate change, ruling on the digital giants, ruling on global finance. It's clear that either we do it better and in a more effective and more democratic way at European level, or we'll let our competitors over the ocean or toward the Far East decide it for us. This is, for me, the basic reason why we need a European reform.
Anders, you also wrote a book, and if I've got the English translation right, it comes across as The Great EU Deception, the Media Concealments and Distortions. So tell us, why do you think the EU needs to shrink or go away? And maybe you disagree with Sandro's characterization that nations are completely powerless on some of these issues.
I think my primary point is that we have to treat Brexit as the symptom, not the illness. The illness is still here in Brussels. What led to Brexit had not been handled, and what I have described as a deceit has been Europe's inability to be forward with its people. For instance, let's take something like the Euro construction. Even the founding fathers of the Euro construction knew that it was not going to be a survivable construct. They knew that we needed two-pack, six-pack, possibly Euro bonds, a lot of other institutional things to make a common currency work, and a Euro budget, and a European finance minister. But we just implemented the currency and hope nobody took notice of that. And now we are seeing the consequences with a much harder recession in Europe than we, for instance, saw in the US. I could also mention the Schengen border-free area. We are now in the LIBE committee, year after year, repairing fundamental errors from, if you want an external border, if you want to abolish the internal borders, you need to have the external borders. But just something like PNR took 5-6 years to get through Parliament, even though we gave the Canadians, the Americans the same information. Even simple things like an entry-exit system for Schengen passport holders is something we just come about to do now. And at least 10,000 new border guards that we've been promised by a younger State of the Union, I was one of the shadows on that file, and I don't think that the result that has come out of that file is going to give the Europeans the security that they think, if they heard Juncker, they would get from it.
You hit on something, I've got to follow up for you there, where you are actively involved in legislative files, and I'll be honest, a lot of the more Eurosceptic members of Parliament, they're not. They don't often turn up and do their actual job. So now that you're joining this new bloc with Salvini, do you think that's going to be a watershed after this election, that there'll be more Eurosceptics who are actually going to turn up and do their legislating jobs?
I think we've seen change in some of these parties. First of all, some of them have went into government, which I think is a good disciplinating exercise. So if you hold government positions, let's say in Austria, let's say in Italy, you start to, it's a transformation process for any new party going into government. The other thing is that I've seen more and more of the patriotic national conservative movements around Europe reapproaching their stance in Europe, saying we have to reform it from within. So you can maybe not do, as Nigel have done so eloquently, give big speeches in the European Parliament, be a big media person, but not really showing anything, delivering anything for the voters on the everyday things. And of course, we should not lose sight of the reformation of Europe that we want to have. But I think at least my voters in Denmark insist that I try to make the world a better place, even though I'm not going to revolutionize it tomorrow. So I'm jokingly saying I'm only electable for things that I want to change. I was elected in the Danish regions. I want to abolish them. And now I'm here in the European Parliament. Probably don't want to abolish it, but I want to reform it.
Sandro, first of all, any response there to Anders? And second, isn't he right that the EU does continually fail to connect with citizens? Isn't that a fundamental problem with this idea of more integration?
I'm surprised to take Brexit as an example, because Brexit is exactly the example of a disaster to which the policies of people like Salvini or Le Pen which Anders Elias will bring. Because I would like to remind to this audience then on the 24th of June 2016, Beppe Grillo, Matteo Salvini, and Marine Le Pen said repeatedly how great is Brexit, and they propose Italexit and Frexit. So if you want to know what the nationalists are going to do tomorrow, remember what they said yesterday. And don't trust what their ambiguous speech they will follow now in the European election, only because they see which mess is Brexit. And by the way, they're messing up also today, but if you want, we come back on that. So, I mean, if there is an example of the disaster to which nationalistic policies bring, take Brexit is a perfect, based on fake news, based on 300 million to NHS each week. This is exactly the propaganda with Marine Le Pen, with Matteo Salvini. Good luck in your group, in their group with these people, Anders. This is the way they will handle things at national level and at European level. Remind this. On the rest, it is clear. To me, the European Union can reconnect better with its citizens if it is an efficient and democratic problem solver. And I insist there are on certain issues on which only the European Union can be a problem solver. The issue is how to make it more effective and how to make it more democratic. These are the fundamental points.
So how are we going to do it then? Is it something like a constitutional convention? Because it strikes me that whatever side of the argument you're on, there's a lot of people now who are not happy with the status quo. Do we actually need to go through that process like in 2002 and 3 and try and redraw the whole frame of the Union?
The status quo is the best ally of the nationalists. So, I mean, even the so-called pro-European parties and even the so-called pro-European leaders, which for a decade they have postponed to tomorrow difficult, important decisions because it was never the moment, these policies, which is a very shy policy, which is a very short-sighted policy, has been the real engine, the real fuel in the engine of the nationalists. If they listen to the person who is speaking to you now and to his Prime Minister Matteo Renzi in 2014, the leaders here, when we were saying migration is a European problem, it's not a Greek and Italian problem, if we were heard in 2014, probably we have taken away some horse battle to the nationalists. So, I mean, the status quo and the defender of the status quo and the very cautious leaders that they say it is never the moment, they are the best ally of the nationalists. We need a fundamental reform. Now,
how about is Angela Merkel your best ally?
No, I haven't. I haven't thought about it that way before. You know, being a Dane, we have the unofficial world record in referendums on the European Union, and that is not because the Danish politicians like it any more than any other European politicians. It's just because we have a constitution that demands it. But I can't help to wonder a little that all of these very sort of pro-Europe politicians, every time we've seen referendums being held in member states, we have seen no's. We've seen no's in Ireland, we have seen them in the UK, we have seen them in Denmark, we have seen them in Sweden, we have seen them in the Netherlands, we have seen them in France, we have seen them in Hungary. And at some point, you must stop up and ask, are we as politicians wrong, or is it the people who get it wrong? And I actually applaud people like my good friend and colleague here, who passionately defend the European ideal. And I agree with him in one of his points that the mainstream politicians of the SD and the EPP too often don't want to defend their European ideas to the public and just go to Brussels and make them come through in a little bit subvert way. They don't do the public debate. They don't go out and defend them. So I actually think it's a more honest debate when you have people like me who has a skeptical approach and people who really want to defend them. But every time I, for instance, mention Mr. Verhofstadt to my liberal colleagues in Denmark, they would rather be seen with the devil than be compared to Mr. Verhofstadt. And I think that's a shame, because if they want him as leader, they should defend the ideals. And that, I think, is one of the problems with the European debate, at least in my country, I think also in other countries, that have it honestly then. I can accept...
But if you can't have it honestly in your country with all these referendums, how is it possible to have it honestly?
I think it's about I think it's about the foundation of democracy. I think democracy demands a public sphere and a demos, a people. And even though we have these great events here in the Brussels bubble and we have many nationalities here, let's be honest, it's not the thing that the majority of the Danes or the French or the Italians are going to watch tonight. And I think that's one of the problems with having an honest debate. That is that to a large for large cultural reasons, you cannot really have a true European narrative and a true European debate. It is segmented into different spheres, national states, and even in some member states, for instance, the one we are living in now, maybe into 2 or 3 different debates.
Well, maybe there's a third way. Sandro, you've previously supported a 2-speed Europe back in 2015. Are you still supporting that as a way forward? And then, Anders, you can respond and let us know if that would sort of reduce some of your concerns about the EU, if you could be in that slow lane.
Yeah, first of all, let me remind that there has been around Europe, since the beginning of our European process, if I'm not mistaken, 46 or 47 referenda. And the vast majority of the referendums said yes to Europe. So to say that each time the people are asked to vote on Europe in a referendum, they vote no, it is the historical false assumption. But certainly we need to more, I agree with Anders, we need more open debate. To me, Brussels is one European city. I don't see this obsession about Brussels. I mean, it's one capital, there are other capitals. So I really don't understand why we have to use Brussels permanently as a scapegoat. It's one of the capital of our union. Yes, I'm for you, to respond to answer to your question, I am for the Europe of the political free will. So I think that if there is a group of peoples and governments and countries who want to deepen their integration, they should do so without obliging all the others to follow along that path, but without accepting that anybody can veto them. I think that this is the best, most democratic, most transparent way for those who want to go ahead to achieve their objectives, and for those who are perfectly happy with the single market, they can remain perfectly happy in the single market. On only one thing, I don't think that can be more than one speed. It is respect of rule of law and fundamental rights. On that, there aren't 2, 3, or 4 speeds. There is only one speed, because there is something which is common to all our Europeans. Since the very beginning, if there is a one European identity, is respect of rule of law and fundamental rights. So on that, no compromise is possible, because it's the heart of our union.
Anders, can you sign up to that, or how would you tweak that vision?
It depends if it's truly, first of all, we have multi-speed Europe. We have countries with opt-outs, mine is one of them, UK is another, Ireland is a third, but even like the Czech Republic is not part of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, they got the opt-out for that, and so on and so forth. So that's already the reality. And I think one of the reasons that Danes are a little bit more happy with their membership of the European Union is because they are protected from some of the things that they would see as bad things, like, for instance, the Eurozone, for instance, the common justice and home affairs and migration policies of Europe. I think that makes many Danes happy that they are primarily seeing it as a market project, an economical project, that doesn't necessarily need to have these other political layers to it. So if we respect that that can truly be the case, that just because someone goes ahead, others are not forced to follow in 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 years, as it have been in a way in the past where, for instance, new membership countries had to adopt the Eurozone, for instance. Then I think it could be a very good way to respect that some people want a deeper union, and respect that other countries, for cultural reasons or other reasons, would prefer less integration.
So you got a new potential majority.
There we go. Look at that. But now I'm going to make you each step out of your shoes and think like the other one for a second. Sandro, what's the thing you like least about the EU?
The thing that I like least?
Or the thing you'd most want to get rid of if you were sitting in the 13th floor of the Parliament?
I think that the red tape.
That's quite general.
The obsolescence of, well, I mean, what can I say otherwise?
Or maybe you'd put sunset clauses on regulation. Is that something you'd think about?
I think that the fact that what we do is open to very fast obsolescence. And we should find way of being updating us and keep the path with the digital revolution, innovation more more quickly. I think that this would be something very much welcomed by citizens and firms. And we haven't found out the way.
Anders, what's your favorite part of the EU?
My favorite part is I think what most Danes thought they voted on. That's the common market, and that's the idea of a free trade bloc that can also trade not only with ourselves, but also reach out to other parts of the world. Coming from a very small open economy, it's very important for us that we have a market to interact with, and we also open up that market to the rest of the world. And that is also why I think one of the downsides, many downsides of Brexit is that we will probably see a bit more protectionism. And I'm very unhappy, for instance, in this mandate that the TTIP negotiations have been going in the way they have been. And I think the Europeans tend to forget that even before the election of Mr. Trump, very prominent members of government in both France and Germany had been out and speaking against the TTIP agreement. So we have a problem on the free trade agenda, not only in the US, but also here in Europe.
So if we talk about how you build new majorities for change somehow. If you take Anders' point that he thinks the single market is the thing people could agree on, Sandra, what would you suggest needs to happen around the fact that the single market basically doesn't exist in 3/4 of the economy, which is the services sector?
Well, I think that we have two big priorities and one evergreen. The evergreen is the issue of services, as you say, where even major economies have been very resistant to open and to build up a real single market. The two big priorities, which were a priority also in 2014, I remember the program of our presidency at the beginning of this legislature, are energy and digital. And on energy and digital, we have wasted time, we have been too slow, and that must be the two of the utmost priorities in the new term. On free trade agreement, Anders, I think that you have to deepen the discussion with Matteo Salvini and Marine Le Pen, because I'm not sure that they will agree with what you just said. I can see some of your point. I'm not saying that Matteo and Salvini and Matteo and Marine will agree with you.
But that's basically the point, and I think it's a bit funny because now I've been in the European Parliament for 5 years. I've been working as a staffer for 2 years, and sometimes my pro-European colleagues always say, "Oh, you're always disagreeing so much." If I talk to my social democratic colleagues from Denmark, who are also good free traders, I could also remind them about a lot of their colleagues who have a different opinion. When I want to fight social dumping, for instance, in the transportation sector, I can also disagree a lot with my Eastern European colleagues, but we will still be colleagues the day after because we share other political points. But this idea, and I think that's sometimes the difference, that is that I accept that Europe is so diverse that you cannot really, even if you take the same ideological stream, put everything into the same box. And you will see disagreements, East and West and North and South, in all political groups. And I think also, without predicting where you are going to end up in a new group, we're waiting for you. No, we came out, now we're waiting for you. But whether you're making a new group or you're joining ALDE or you're doing something third, I would also be very happy to see how much, if you can agree on all issues all time, I'm not sure that that's going to happen either.
Now, let me challenge you on one of Sandro's original points, Anders, where he was saying there are just some issues you can only deal with in a cross-border way. Things like migration and climate change. So let's take migration. That's not really the single market. There's a bit of overlap, but it's not really the single market. How on earth is less Europe going to help Danes be protected? How can you have that external border if there's not more Europe to make it happen?
First of all, I think many people in Brussels ought to look into what happened in the migration crisis, and is that really European solutions? The Turkey deal was brokered between a national leader, Angela Merkel, and Erdogan. It was the Hungarians who decided very unilaterally to reintroduce border controls, and that tripled up all the way that we now have, which is quite new between Denmark and Sweden, border controls again. And
but if you had a proper European plan, it wouldn't be up to individual bilateral action, would it?
Of course, because if I was a European dictator or had the vast majority, we could easily find European solutions for everything. Because then it would be the right solution.
All right, okay, I'm not sure where we're going with that one.
It's already a step ahead, because there isn't a European dictator, you're saying. Oh, that's good, because when I hear some of your live speaking, it sounds like if there was a European dictator.
I know, I think that's a nice go-to, but if we are living in the real world, it's meaningless to talk about a European solution, because a solution can only be judged on the content of what's in it. So if what's on the table, and I think what's on the table from the Commission, and especially from the Parliament, is a horrible solution to the migration problem, then of course I'm not in favor of Europeanizing it. If there was, for instance, a majority of European leaders and European Parliament who wanted to work for implementing a version of the Australian model, I would think it would be a good solution.
We don't have that already?
No, not at all, because the Australian model is based on the premise that you will be returned, and therefore we will hinder the human smuggling, and we will stop the suffering of people dying in the Mediterranean Sea and in the deserts coming up. So no,
but
what
we're returning
now,
people effectively to Libya now, often to appalling conditions.
You need to do it like the Australians are doing it in a complete uniform way, because otherwise it doesn't have effect. It's like you cannot be half pregnant. You cannot have half an Australian model. But the solution on the table right now is clearly a non-solution. The solution now is just we fight about people that, if we should be honest for a moment, nobody wants. The Southern Europeans say they want a European solution that is just to divide them into Northern Europe and Eastern Europe. The Northern Europeans say, oh, they come here anyway, but we don't want any more. And the Eastern Europeans say, we have seen the lessons from what you guys did, we don't want to repeat it. So I beg you to come up to a European solution when you have that happening. It will not happen. The only real solution is to be honest and say there is no appetite anywhere in Europe to receive illegal migrants in the numbers that are coming.
Now, Sandro, I'm Australian, so I know that Australian model pretty well. If there's one thing that it does that I could agree with as being effective, it's that it does stop people drowning. If we were to implement more of that policy in Europe, is that a bad example of more Europe, or are all examples of more Europe good?
To say that, Europe doesn't want migration, it's like if I was complaining because I wish that Brussels is always sunny. Yes, but sometimes it rains. And when it rains, what do? You say, well, it should be sunny, or you take an umbrella and you handle with rain. Migration is a phenomenon which will be there. Salvini can do propaganda and say close its ports. It's not true. The ports are not closed in Italy, but he's saying that. We can say we don't want one single migrant. We can say we don't want European approaches. We can say we want only national politics. The issue is how we take back control. And from this perspective, I envy a lot Michael Gove and Boris Johnson's slogan. Because let's take back control, which was the Brexit slogan, it is the very right question. The problem for the Brits, the wrong answer, because you cannot take back control going back to nationalistic policies to handle the issue such as migration. Migration, either we develop a common European approach, which is manifold, which is based on a new relation with Africa, including return agreements, to take a part of the Australian model, which is based on common border police, was a proposal of the Italian president in 2014, which is now has been agreed. It took 5 years, and it's going to be implemented in many years. We have to be faster in implementing this decision. And then, of course, to develop a real common approach to asylum, if we want to keep our freedoms. And to me, the fact that we Europeans, in our European space, we are free to move. We are free to study abroad. We are free to open a business everywhere we want. We are free to provide services, unless some obstacles. To me, it's the best gift that Europe has given to us. We have to preserve by taking back control on issues such as migration. This is the approach. But, the new allies of funders, also on this, they do not agree on anything. How can you think that Marine Le Pen and Matteo Salvini would be effective in managing migration when Matteo Salvini say, I want to redistribute the migrants everywhere in Europe, and Marine Le Pen say, not one single migrant in France, and Orban, which is their secret dreams to have an allies, when we ask him to take 700 refugees in a year, when in Lampedusa we had 10,000 migrants arriving every day, Orban say no, and we had to bring an action before the Court of Justice, and violating also from this perspective rule of law, it implement this.
Let's get on to this.
How can they manage? How can they take back control on this issue?
One reply from you, Anders, and we'll get on to the question of allies.
To the facts, actually, the redistribution would have taken migrants out of Hungary at that time. So one of the countries, including, together with Lampedusa and Greece, was actually Hungary. So Viktor Orban stood on a point that he was against the redistribution. From a cost-benefit analysis at the time, he would have had less migrants if he had implemented the plan. So maybe if we stay to the real world and the real arguments that nobody wants them, and that's exactly the point I made before, and that is why the only realistic way to deal with illegal migration and to get more support for legal migration is to deal with it in a way where we end it.
But then don't you need something like an EU-wide visa? You know, if I am someone who's looking for a front door rather than a back door into Europe, I have to be able to walk through a front door, and there isn't one at the moment a lot of the time.
I think that the best way to do it is that the member states have the policies, and then when you become a permanent resident, then you can obtain the rights to move around, and then we can make common rules for that. I think that's the best way to ensure that people are coming for the right reasons, they are coming in an orderly fashion, and when they have settled down and they stay somewhere permanently, they start to become Europeanized and they get the European rights and obligations. But for instance, let's look into the transportation sector. We have seen work visas given in Poland amounting to people being paid down to €3 an hour driving lorries into Denmark. You know, we had that exact case in the southern part of Denmark.
Okay,
so we need to have a well-regulated way of doing it.
Let's get on to the question of allies now. You're obviously in the market for allies in this new group that Matteo Salvini announced earlier this week. Who are the targets? Would you accept Viktor Orban, and are you having discussions with Fidesz, for example, to bring him in?
We are having very broad discussion, and there's a very broad invitation we launched in Milan.
So that's a yes?
You know, Viktor Orban is a little bit like the girlfriend in high school that you wanted but cannot get. To be honest...
Actually speechless.
Viktor Orban is courted by the EPP, he's courted by the ECR, and he's also courted by everyone else, I think. To be honest, I don't think he's serious when it comes down to business about this. I think he will stay with his friends in the EPP group. That has been the inclination all through the time I've been in Brussels, and I think it will continue on. So, you know, it's not something that I waste a lot of sleep over and waste a lot of work on. What I will say is I think it's much more interesting what my current group and how they are going to approach this, because it is an open invitation, and I think they have been silly in the way they have been approaching both their enlargement and their future strategy, and I think they should come to their senses and start working together with people instead of excluding people. I think it comes from a bit of a British perception that you are a little bit better than the rest of the parties in this side of the spectrum. And to be honest, I think it's the wrong strategy.
Because the truth is, if all the Eurosceptics united, you'd be the biggest party in Parliament, wouldn't you?
At least we'll be in the competition, and I think the people who vote for these parties deserve the influence that goes with such a big fraction. You know, and as I said in Milan on Monday, the only one winning with the strategy that we have been following so far has been the people that wants the opposite, who wants the United States of Europe. And to be honest, when I look into the other parliamentary groups, I could also find a lot of examples that will embarrass my Danish colleagues. And for some strange reason, no of my Danish colleagues have been out from me this week. And I think that's because they know that they don't want me to talk about, for instance, Social Democrats in Eastern Europe's approach to homosexuality. They don't want to talk about Mr. Babiš's government in the Czech Republic. They don't want me to talk about a lot of things. So the truth is that there is a lot of things that divide in all the groups, and we can easily embarrass each other. But I think my voters deserve the most influence for the votes that they are casting for my party.
Now let's get real, because on the question of allies, you're not each necessarily from those big groups in the parliament. But at the end of the day, if you're elected as MEPs, you're going to have to vote for somebody to become European Commission President. So Sandro, who amongst the candidates is the best candidate for a more European Commission?
Well, I mean, let me say first that we are not chasing Orban as an ally and neither as a girlfriend.
Okay, that's an easy point for you, but now back to the hard question. Who are you going to vote for?
Well, listen, I'm pretty skeptical on the current system of Spitzenkandidaten in this political framework.
And we can agree on that too, but at the end of the day, you'll have to vote for someone.
Well, not necessarily one of those.
Okay.
Not necessarily one of those.
You can name someone now. Who would you like to see?
Not necessarily one of those. I want to see what is the potential candidate designated by the European Council who is able, he or she,
Matteo Renzi, for example.
No. Matteo Renzi is a good senator in Italy and is doing an excellent job in opposing the crazy government of Gilets jaunes, Matteo Di Maio, and Le Peniste Matteo Salvini. So, I mean, it's good that Matteo Renzi remains there. But, I mean, I would like to see who is the candidate who get the vast majority.
I was looking for a name. You didn't give me one, so I'm moving on. Anders, is Manfred Weber the best candidate for a less Europe?
Manfred Weber has a nasty habit of always saying unnice things about my party, so I would love to see him come crawling back and ask for my support. So it's sure if he comes to my office, I will have a chat with him. But I think the best Commission president we could have in the next mandate would be someone who comes from a position in government, maybe someone with a long experience as a prime minister who has knowledge of real issues. And I will actually go with a liberal. I think a person like Mark Rutte would be a good candidate. He's not going to agree with me on everything, but I think he has a more sensible approach to the European cooperation.
Mr. Rasmussen in Denmark might need a job come July.
Mr. Rasmussen might need a job come July. Helle Thorning-Schmidt might need a job. Margrethe Vestager might need a job. We could have an entire Danish commission if you wanted it. But
there are already two extra names.
Yeah.
I could, female name from them are two extra names.
Yeah. If you wanted me, I would also go for it. But anyway, if we stay, if
not neither Elle, your name is not Elle, neither Margrethe, no?
No. But a Dane is a Dane. If you want us, you can get us. No, but seriously speaking, I think you should go for one. A well-trusted leader, and I would say a profile like Mark Rutte or like Anders Fogh Rasmussen when he...
there's another one.
Another Rasmussen.
Yeah, but it doesn't sound like Weber cuts it in your eyes.
I think Weber... I think the entire Spitzenkandidat thing was something the European Parliament did to boost our own morale, and now where we know the EPP will win every time, the people who endorsed it last time is just crawling away from it. It's not very principled. It is a bit Euro-populist that, okay, if we don't win it, we don't want it. No. I think Weber is...
No, Anders. It's a very simple coherence factor that in 2014 it was the first attempt to introduce a better European democracy. Then we have proposed, I was the first to propose after Brexit, to use the 73 Brexit seats to elect women and men in transnational lists in one single European constituency. And it is clear that if my proposal, which then became Macron's proposal, and with Macron and Nathalie Loiseau, I, as Europe Minister, fought a lot in the Council and the Parliament, if the European People's Party had accepted this proposal, which was a step ahead in strengthening the European link between citizens and the European dimension, because citizens would have directly voted the European political movement. The number one of this list could have become naturally the potential candidate to the president of the Commission. In this system,
now there are
with
two
the contradiction
theories about why that didn't happen. One of them is that the EPP was afraid, for example, that the Liberals had a bunch of star glamour candidates, that they could do really well in that transnational list and kind of have a backdoor claim on the Commission presidency. And then the other theory was they were basically worried Marine Le Pen would run, that she'd win because the EPP and Socialists have a bunch of stiffs and that they wouldn't attract any votes. Do you think either of those two reasons are true about why the transnational list was killed?
I don't know if they are the true reason. They are both wrong, because it is clear that when you introduce such an innovative system, you can also think to innovative and new European political movement, like we will try to set up, a new political groups, and you never can be scared of democracy, and that would have been to double the democratic choice.
You'd run in those transnational lists and go for Commission President?
I would have loved to run as number 2 after Mr. Salvini on a transnational list, and I would love to see what would happen if Mr. Salvini would have gotten the most votes. I'm sure then the rules would have been changed a little again.
But you voted against.
Because it's basically a constitutional crisis.
I'm voting
against. You didn't think about that, but you voted against.
Of course, I voted against because I stand with the point I made earlier, that democracy need a publicity and they need a demos, they need a people. And therefore, trans-European lists will just be a beauty contest about the most contested, controversial politicians in Europe. Last time around, it was Nigel Farage and Marine Le Pen. This time around, it's Viktor Orban, Mr. Macron, and Mr. Salvini. And they would get all the attention.
Yeah, but isn't every election a beauty contest?
Then I would not get elected. I'm not very beautiful.
But this, all right. It's time for some questions from the audience.
Only on the inside,
Okay. Who's got a question?
Democracy with new actor in town.
Yeah. Yes, so you've got microphones in the side of your seat. I'll go against the grain. Is there anyone with a less Europe or we don't like Europe question? Stick your hand up now. I didn't think there'd be many in this room. Okay, anyone else with a question, stick your hand up, and we will take a couple. The lady in the middle here, yep. You just take the, lift up the armrest, flip it open, yep, and there's a microphone in there. And if you just say who you are, and if you're representing somebody, mention the organization too. Yep, there should be a button there. Should be. Ooh. Sorry, it's on the side of the, it's in the armrest. Apologies to everyone at home listening.
Sarah McCabe from the Irish Perm Rep. My question is, there was lots of talk about, the faults of the EU and the reforms needed and, the problems that led to Brexit. But what are your views on the media portrayal of the problems of the EU and Euroscepticism among media in the UK and among media ownership, and how much is a communication problem as opposed to actual structural problems?
Sandro, you go first.
Yes, certainly it is also a media communication problem. I'm very critical of media, for example, in my country, but I think that also it depends on how those who are in politics live, present, and defend the European issues. And the media would follow. In the UK example, I mean, in UK, all the political class have been doing EU bashing for years from Monday to Saturday. If you do EU bashing from Monday to Saturday against before your citizens, and on Sunday, like David Cameron did, ask to the citizens if they want to remain or leave the UK, it's very likely that the answer would be, we want to leave, because we have been telling you in Westminster, you in the government, you have been telling for years that EU, it is the origin of all our problems. This has been the problem in UK, notably with the tabloid, but not only. There has never been, for years, in the last decades, in UK, there has never been a strong defense of the European cause, and also of how, a strong explanation of how UK was influenced here. If in UK, the people in government, in parliament, had explained to the citizens how much the British have been influenced here in Brussels, and they've been in basically all the EU institutions. And of course, I'm telling you that the British were very influential in the EU institution if they had been a little bit more transparent. And if they had,
should it be Brits doing that, or should Juncker have gone in and campaigned in the referendum?
Absolutely. I mean, when I was teaching here, I asked to my students, it was 15 years ago, to see your national press, and find some article of the media where they say Brussels made me do it, or it's Brussels' fault. And there was a blossoming of crazy article about Brussels' fault. But the point that, I mean, in UK, the EU bashing has been very effective, very permanent, and it lasted for a long time. And in my view, this is what is at the origin, and it has been a vicious circle between a certain political discourse and the media action. And the result is there. And I'm worried because this EU bashing is flourishing, is flourishing also in other European countries. We have to stop. We have to stop with this national European sport to say everything it is difficult, tricky, and unpopular. It's Brussels' fault. Everything is good.
Now, Anders,
it is our victory.
Is bad press coverage good journalism? Is it people just asking tough questions, or are you in a bit of a conspiracy with some newspapers?
Yeah, I can hear that. You know, it's so easy to be Eurosceptic. We are so lofty in Brussels and everywhere else. You know, that's why we have such good elections. I think this is the complete conspiracy theory of why people don't understand Brexit or don't understand Trump. It's Russia, it's the media, it's not good enough. Let me take my own example of Denmark. All newspapers are declared pro-European. All institutions, labor, employers, everyone is pro-European. Everyone would say vote yes, for instance, to leave the opt-outs. That is the uniform answer you'll get also from European experts.
You had a referendum.
Yeah, no, but I'm
ago.
talking about NGOs.
Institutionally.
All the institutional bodies, the vast majority of the politicians, the vast majority of like employers associations, labor associations, think tanks, European experts, all of them are more or less declared pro-Europeans. And despite of that, Danes tend to vote no when it comes to European referendums. So this idea that if just the Brits have had different media, and let's not say that there's also pro-European media in Britain. Actually, I think one of the beautiful things about the British media landscape is it's so diverse. You can find both opinions. It's very invigorating for if you read both sides, you almost think it's a different country you're living in. It's very beautiful, but I think it's just an easy scapegoat not to take it seriously. And I'm so because it's the same. I'm sorry, it's the same thing you say all the time, and it's the same. It's the Russian bots. It's
Russian. I never spoke about
Russia.
Russian.
No, but in this Brussels sentiment,
do you think
no one here in Brussels has
Sandro's right of reply, and then we'll wrap it up.
I'm learning that Russia had an influence on the Italian referendum constitution. That's what you're saying? You might be right. You might be right also that they tried to influence the French election. You might be right. You are saying that the Russian had an influence on the UK? I haven't said that. You said it. You might be right. But I didn't say that.
Scapegoating to the same bad excuses.
I didn't say that.
Not to take the people seriously.
The question was...
I love how rare is it to get an actual debate in Brussels.
The question was whether the British media had a role in influencing the public opinion in UK. I never spoke about conspiracy. I never spoken about plot. I never spoken about pro or anti-European press. It is a fact that in one of the most influential members of the European Union, such as UK, nobody or a tiny part of the ruling class has been effective in explaining the big advantages that UK is getting from the EU. And when you don't explain the big advantages, this is not a conspiracy, you get a boomerang effect. What it happened to UK, it is a boomerang effect. If they had been a little bit more honest in explaining how influential UK is in EU, in my view, the result of the referendum would be different, because it is not a matter of 2-month campaign. It is a matter of 20 years of approach. But about the Russian,
you're not taking my point on board. That in a country like Denmark,
about the Russians,
where you have the complete opposite.
But about the Russians,
we didn't go Russia. That was my fault. Let's skip Russia, and Anders, you got to find
the Russian is your problem, because your Matteo Salvini leader has got a formal alliance with the Russian Unity Party of Putin. Your leader thinks that Putin is a reference. Your leader has got very strong political, formal, and maybe other kind of links with Putin. So that is your problem. It is not mine. So everything is linked to Russia. You will deal it. You will deal it in the European Parliament.
Okay, one final question to the two of you. Speaking of uncomfortable allies here. But you both have to answer it. So, Sandro, you got to be on the soapbox there. But can you name one pro-EU ally that makes you uncomfortable? Who's the creepy uncle you don't want at the party?
A pro-European ally that makes me...
Someone who you think is just going too far down that federalist track.
No, I mean, to me, it's impossible to answer.
Too much Europe is never enough.
No,
right.
no. To me,
who's your
to
creepy
the president of the European federalism.
Is Vladimir Putin one step too far for you?
Of course.
Or is there someone else?
From a Danish perspective, Vladimir Putin is way too far, but that is why I don't want a foreign affairs policy of Europe. That is so Denmark can stay with our transatlantic allies, and Italy and France and Germany can be as pro-Russian, left, right, and center as you want to. You can sell your military ships there, you can buy their gas, and you can do all the trades with these countries that you want, as long as you just leave my
We're not going down a gas rabbit hole.
Denmark.
Right.
As long as you just leave my
Sandro, a round of applause for our two debaters. It's very, very good. And we've got some Twitter results. I'm going to read out the result of those Twitter polls. So, are you for the EU or against the EU? 68% of those watching were for the EU, and 32% were against. pretty much in line with the general population, so good to know we have a representative audience. And then the question of, does the EU need light reforms or serious reforms? And again, exactly the same figures, 68% say light reforms, 32% say serious reforms. Gentlemen, thank you very much for a very spirited debate. Another round of applause. Thank you. Okay, swiftly on to round two. You've got a lot to live up to, guys. I will quickly explain. Oh no, I'll invite you all onto the stage. I'm going to invite Matthew, Eleni, and Cornelius, who are our next three panelists. Matthew, if you come up first and sit next to me. And then I'll explain who you all are when you get on the stage. Eleni, please come up. Oh, okay. And Cornelius. So joining me now on the stage, we have Matthew Shattuck, who is the head of political betting at Ladbrokes. I don't know if you've followed it at all online, but they're doing these really interesting little horse race graphics, and they're running betting odds in all 27, possibly 28 countries participating in the EU Parliament election in May, and also odds on the Spitzencandidate race for Commission President. Eleni Vavitsiotti is the correspondent for Kati Morini here in Brussels. They're our partner on the National Playbook in Greece that's coming out tomorrow, and you're one of the best journalists here. We're old Summit buddies. And Cornelius Hirsch, he is the co-founder of polofpols.eu, a website we loved so much we bought it at Politico. But I promise we invited him here before that all took place. And the point of inviting these three perspectives is to kind of show that there are different ways you can approach looking at the election, and that each of them have some valid points, and to find out which one might be doing best or which one you support most. But I wanted to do a little poll of the audience before I get into asking these guys questions. So unfortunately for everyone online, it's just for people in the room. But can I ask you to raise your hands if you've ever placed a bet before on an election outcome or some kind of political race? Okay.
Not bad.
Not bad, but it's a small minority, I'll be honest, and it looked like a bunch of men with their hands in the air. Now, who of you looks at opinion polls? You know, is that something you turn to when you see it in the paper or TV? Okay, that's an overwhelming majority in the room for that one. And now, who among you pays with your own money, not your boss's money, for a newspaper or a cable television subscription? Okay, not as many as the opinion polls, but you know, not bad. Okay, now we know what we're working with in terms of interest and knowledge. But I'll kick off with each of you sort of explaining your expertise. So my question is, what are your top sources of intelligence when you arrive at the judgments that you arrive at for the European Parliament elections? Matthew, you kick it off.
Yeah, I mean, I must say that Cornelius does a great job with his site. So mostly when we're starting off trying to come up with odds, this is kind of an experiment for us, having odds on every single state, because our team don't know very much about Slovenian politics, to be honest, or Maltese politics. So we'll start with opinion polls, some fairly simple maths, which can give you an expected probability of which parties might win. Because at the moment, the only odds we're offering on the individual countries are which individual party will win the most seats in that country. And that will start off the odds to begin with. And then it's really just a question of the supply and demand of our customers. If more money is going on one particular party, so for instance, the other night I saw a rush of bets on the Pirate Party in the Czech Republic to win the most seats, then their odds come down as a result. Mm-hmm. And it's very little about our opinion, it's more just to do with the to and fro of the market.
Mm-hmm. Now, Eleni, you are sort of hopefully have been watching the summit very closely as well.
Yes,
so
exactly.
I know leaders are one source of knowledge for you. How else are you kind of tuning your dial when it comes to the elections?
I mean, for me, it's pretty hard. The challenge is to make my readers being interested in the European politics, which is pretty hard. And for these EU elections, maybe it's even harder because it might coincide with the national elections in my country. So you have to find an interesting way to tell your readers who are these people, who are these groups that they are representing, and why is it so important for you. And that, I can tell you, it has been quite a challenge. Because it's minimum interest. It's really sad to see that people are like really interested in their national politics, and the European agenda is second or third rate news for us.
Mm-hmm. Now, Cornelius, it's pretty obvious you use opinion polling as a source, so maybe I'll tweak it for you. How does your algorithm work? Like, how do you balance the fact that there aren't that many polls about specifically the European Parliament election, but there's a bunch of national polls?
So yeah, that's the biggest challenge for us, the lack of data in certain countries. But we're really agnostic about all the polls. So we take all national polls and we take all European Parliament specific polls from each country and try to come up with a seat estimate for each country. And yeah, if there aren't any, then we have to use certain proxies, right? I mean, we went back to 2014 and compared the difference between the national polls days, like one day before the European Parliament election, and looked at the difference and saw that in a lot of countries there's not a structural difference. And if there aren't any polls in some countries, like in Luxembourg, for example, then we just have to use like the last election result to come up with a proxy for the seat calculation.
Mm-hmm. And then maybe a general question that any of you can feel free to answer. How have you seen your judgments change during the course of the campaign? I mean, we're only really getting into the heat of the election campaign now, but obviously people have been talking about this or selecting candidates or running polls for a few months. Have your judgments changed at all over that time about what's going to happen at the end of May?
Well, I mean, there's one sort of bias in the betting markets, in European betting markets recently, which is people tend to overestimate, or at least people who are betting their money tend to overestimate how well the populist right is going to do in elections. Mm-hmm. We sort of saw that in the Netherlands, in Norway, in Sweden, in their recent national elections. So I've kind of been waiting for that to happen with these elections, and it hasn't really yet. So there doesn't seem to be that much confidence that any of these parties in countries like the ones I've just mentioned, that they might overtake the more established parties and win the most seats. So at the moment, it does seem like we're more likely to get, based on the betting, big establishment traditional parties doing well, and I'm still waiting for that surge in support for right-wing parties. And that may happen much nearer the election, because most of the bets we take will probably be in the last week. But so far, no sign.
Mm-hmm. And Eleni, are we all still in the shadow of the bailout in Greece, or is there some other factor that's changing the dynamic there?
I mean, because it's going to be with the national elections, it's like a big thing. There is a possibility that it's going to be with the national elections. But I will agree with Matthew a lot. I mean, when we started, let's say we started following the campaign, the elections more closely, let's say in the fall, there was this expectation that the populists are going to do so much better, the Eurosceptics are going to be so important in the parliament. And as time goes by, you don't see them kicking off. So that is a thing that it was important to follow. And in Greece, yeah, definitely now all parties are, the biggest parties are all pro-European. I mean, there's no doubt about it. So the Euroscepticism is much less, especially also if you think about after so many years of crisis, still Greeks are so pro-European. I mean, there's no doubt about the membership of the country.
Mm-hmm. And I think when you say like what has changed over the course, it's definitely the new alliances that have shaped up a little bit. And I think I can do all the seat calculations I want every day if then suddenly those suddenly certain parties form alliances and that we didn't see coming, or hopefully we know that we don't track at the moment. Then a lot of the math can be completely wrong.
Yeah. Now one. I wouldn't say curveball, that's a bit of an American term, but one thing I didn't see coming when I started working on this election campaign was the idea that Britain might be voting in it. So I don't want to drag us into a big Brexit discussion, but obviously that could shake up the race a little bit. What would each of you predict as your sort of major impact if the Brits actually do end up voting? Eleni, maybe you kick it off.
If the Brits end up voting, I mean, okay, that will change definitely the seats that are going to be given in the parliament. But I think it could be also would give extra interest of what will happen. Some people could see it as a second referendum. I mean, depending on what people will decide in the British elections, it could show maybe if people have changed their mind about Brexit or not. So that will be an interesting thing to see, definitely.
Well, I'm speaking as one of the very few people in Great Britain who really want these elections to happen. It'd be great for me, great for our business. But We do have some preliminary odds on what the outcome would be.
Okay, tell us, please.
So the Labour Party are favourites to get most seats, but quite uneasy favourites, and it's now only, I think, 2-1 that Farage's new Brexit party end up being the biggest group, which will please some people.
And does that mean the Tories are going to get destroyed because you've got the new Change UK, the independents would be in the mix as well?
Our odds at the moment would suggest we're predicting around a 20% vote for the Conservative Party. Okay. Now that's quite plausible because back in 2009 when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister, Labour got to 15%. So it's quite easy to see them getting to really quite a low number.
And there was like a poll published today asking exactly that question, and I think that the Brexit party was at 10%, and the independence group, this Change UK party, something at only 4%.
Okay.
So it was still Labour in the lead quite significantly.
Then maybe I'll put you on the spot with an actual prediction now. The Spitzencandidate race for European Commission President. You can include anyone that Sandra or Anders wanted to put in. There doesn't have to be a declared candidate. But if you had to say now who you think is going to become the Commission President, based on your expertise and all the knowledge you've had, who would you pick?
Well, I'm going to add Anders to the betting as soon as I get out of here tonight at 100-1 to be next president. But based on the betting so far, there's really very little confidence in Weber. I mean, the odds say there's a 90% chance that the EPP will be the biggest group, but there's a 50% chance that Weber will be the next president, so that indicates that people aren't that confident that the
So not many Bavarians have been putting their money down.
No. The big mover in terms of betting has been Barnier, who was 16-1, is now 6-1. And I was very interested to hear Anders mention Mark Rutte, because we did add him a couple of weeks ago at 20-1. So that is interesting. It could easily be somebody slightly unexpected like him, I imagine. Okay. But if I had to pick someone, I'll go for Barnier.
Okay. Eleni?
I think as time goes by, I think that it's more possible for Weber to become the president. I mean, when he was first elected as a Spitzenkandidat for EPP, I was like, oh, okay, there's no way there are going to be so many different things that will happen. But I don't see how, if EPP is the first party, how they're going to not have him as a Spitzenkandidat.
He's the default, right? Someone has to unseat him.
Exactly. So I see this procedure being pretty hard to happen, and I think the parliament is also going to resist and want to keep that power on their hands. And if he does some deals and with the other two big parties, ALDE and the socialists, maybe, I mean, he has the power to do so.
Cornelius?
Yeah, I agree with you actually, like over the trend. But if I need to put down money, maybe I'll talk to you afterwards. Because then it would be Rutte or Vestager, definitely. Okay. I think actually really think that their chances are underrated.
Now that is interesting. So your best return would be if you wanted to risk 10 euros. But none of you said Timmermans, and that's interesting because he has a strategy. Kind of undefined, but it's a fairly obvious strategy. He needs to build a coalition of progressive parties. Technically, he'd be able to do it somehow, but none of you think that that is a likely scenario.
I suppose it's slightly more. I guess it's slightly more likely if the UK Labour Party win 25 seats or something. That slightly increases the bargaining power, I imagine. Okay. I don't know how that would work out.
No. Okay, it's legitimate. Just wanted to make sure we covered off that possibility. Okay, now maybe a couple of specific, do some specific questions for each of you. Cornelius, how do you think polls are affected by the fact that most people don't really have any idea what the European parties are? So, in a sense, maybe people are getting polled almost like in a national poll, even when they're being asked about the European Parliament elections. Yeah,
that's definitely true. And but to be honest, the European Parliament election is basically a collection of 27 or maybe 28 national elections. And in some countries, even the polls don't even specify days, like if there was an election this Sunday. That's like literally the question. And then they use that one as like the proxy for the European Parliament and translate it into seats. Yeah, that's like a big challenge, and that's all I think why in some countries we don't see a big difference between the voting intention by the people. Where we do see a big difference is in the turnout. If they actually ask, hey, if the European Parliament election was this Sunday, would you go and vote? And there we still see some pretty depressing numbers like in the last time.
Oh, now, well, maybe this is slightly off topic, but it reminds me of a question for you, Eleni. In Greece, you have compulsory voting, but only 60% of people vote. So on that question of turnout, I mean, what the hell's going on?
I mean, there's no direct, like, you don't get a fine or punishment for not voting. It is compulsory, but you haven't heard of any case that you didn't go to vote and then there's a case against you. So, but I think in Greece it's pretty high.
No, it's only 60.
It's 60. I mean,
yeah,
compared to other countries, I don't know how high it is.
Yeah, I mean, it's higher than the average,
Yeah.
but among compulsory voting countries, it's much
low.
lower than Belgium and Luxembourg. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe this time around it will be different.
Yep. Now, when I asked who had bet online before, I saw only male hands go up. Do you think that has some, I'm not saying that represents all betting online, but does it skew male? And does that somehow affect the outcome, do you think? I mean, you might be fairly reflecting where the bets are, but do you think that somehow shapes the discussion that you've kind of got men pushing it in one direction?
I actually think that's a great question. I mean, yes, betting is mostly a male activity in the UK, and I would imagine in most other countries in Europe. It does worry me slightly when you look at an event like the EU referendum, where there was a fairly significant gender difference in the way people were voting in that election. Women were more likely to vote Remain. And if the only people are betting are one of those genders, then yeah, sure, it's possible it could skew it. We're not expecting the betting public to be a representative sample of the voting of the electorates. But yeah, there is a small chance that because it's male, I guess it's people with disposable income, that could skew things a little bit. And I do think actually that was one of the problems with the Brexit referendum.
Yeah. And I mean, it's not me having a go at you, but I imagine, I'm looking at things to put into the national playbook, for example, and it just feels like an interesting thing. It's like, oh, something actually changed in this country this week. I can put it in. And then it occurred to me when I was preparing for the panel, oh, maybe I'm just projecting more male thinking in just because it's there. Maybe it's time to bring in audience Q&A. So remember, you've got the microphones in the side panel of your chairs. Who would like to go first with a question? It's got to be one. It's got to be one. Otherwise, we're going to have to talk about the summit. And I wouldn't want to subject you to that. Jameen, in the middle there.
Hi. Hello? Yes.
Yes.
Jamie Patel with LVMH. There's been a lot of articles written about the impact of opinion polls on elections, but also on behaviour of politicians. Now, seeing as you sort of follow this all the time, do you think that it's kind of it's switched now that so politicians are actually led by opinion polls rather than actually trying to shape opinion and then see that reflected in polls? And maybe a follow-up question for the gentleman from Ladbrokes. There was also a very interesting kind of article written about the use of private polling around the referendum. I don't know if there's anything you can say about how that industry is growing, if it's growing, how transparent it is, and how perhaps we can make it more transparent.
You want to kick off, Cornelia?
Yeah, definitely. I actually think it's the other way around, right? I think only informed readers of polls are also informed voters, and also I rather think like if for example, it also helps to correct to a certain extent certain headlines. Like when Berlusconi was re-entering the race, there were headlines all over like Berlusconi's back in the race. Now that's going to change the election or the campaign. And then if people are able to go to our website and see, oh well, Berlusconi is part of an 8% party, then that rather helps them to put those headlines into perspective. So yeah, obviously I would defend polls strongly.
Yes.
Just to follow up though, but I think one of the theories around the Brexit result was partly that people saw the polling the morning of the vote. It was 55-45, if I remember rightly, for Remain, and there's evidence to show that a lot of people didn't bother voting because they thought it was already a done deal.
Or maybe that is a question about the laws around when polls can be published. Maybe that's an argument to say you shouldn't be able to publish a poll in the 72 hours before an election.
That's maybe a discussion one could have. But like if you go back to those polls, you did see that it's close, right? It was within the margin of error, and so I'd rather say it's a a question of how you interpret those polls and how you, once again, what headlines you make out of polls. If there's like a 1 percentage point change and then it said, oh, it's a completely new trend or something, which I often have to read in newspapers, then it's, I don't want to bash the media, sorry, right?
No,
but,
go for it.
Yeah,
but is that a golden rule? Like if you don't see a jump of more than 2 or 3%, don't read too much into it? Is that something that people should take away from this?
And that's also something that we want to contribute with our website and also in the future work with Politico to make polling results better told and better interpreted, and help readers to always have in the back of the mind, well, there's always a margin of error. Like I think that's really important to educate.
Mm-hmm. Do you guys want to add or jump in?
Well, I mean, I take the point about private polling. On the day of the referendum in 2016, the betting markets were saying there was a 75% chance Remain was going to win. By 10 p.m, when the polls had closed, the betting markets were saying there was a 90% chance Remain was going to win before any single result had come through. And I think there's a lot of suspicion, I have no evidence for it, that this was really based on private polls taken on the day, exit polls taken on the day, which, from what one can make out, were predicting a fairly comfortable Remain win. Although I think it's fair to say that if you look back at the last month of that campaign, if you took an average of the polls, it was pretty much 50-50. And now there's an idea that the polls were badly wrong in that election. Well, they weren't. They said it was going to be close. I think the betting markets were slightly less accurate in that particular occasion.
And Eleni, is there an argument that people like us should not ignore the polls, but we should go with what we see and hear and feel? And the case I'll bring to the bear there is, you look at all the polls in the 2016 US election, Hillary, 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 and if I look at everything I saw when I went to a campaign rally or the conventions, it didn't say Hillary, Hillary, Hillary. And I let myself believe things I might have wanted to believe.
You're very right, and that's very hard to do actually, because in the Greek referendum as well, it was everybody was saying it was the polls were saying it's going to be very close. It was a very big difference in the U.S. elections, in Brexit. I mean, it seems like you should not hear, like you have to be, the sirens. You have to close your ears and just follow your heart, because you can understand. If you go out during a campaign, you can understand the feel of the people. You can see how much more dynamic one group or the other is, and you can get a understanding. But the polls are kind of, it's hard not to listen to them as well.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, also there's also a lot of scientific research about that, and over history and throughout time, polls missed parties and like the actual results by about 2 percentage points, and that's very, very, very consistent. Like over the last 50 years or something, one scientific paper compared all the latest polls with the actual result, and on average, it's 2 percentage points that polls miss results. And if you keep that in mind, you won't, you'll always be less surprised.
Yeah. Well, there's also the point, it's like another tangent of the private polling, which is that political parties use their own internal polling. And it's unlikely they would continue to invest in that if it wasn't telling them something they thought was useful. Like if they thought it was really terrible, they would just stop doing it, wouldn't they? Okay, well, he's not going to disagree with me, is he? Time for another question from the audience. Who'd like to go next? Yes, the woman over here in the white jacket.
My name is Antonella Pederiva. Hello. I wanted to ask you whether in polls you take into consideration social media, likes, followers, if this is part of a political assessment for journalists, and the role that social media play actually in a campaign. Thank you.
Eleni, maybe you can go first.
I mean, I always check the followers and likes of certain tweets so I understand trends, but also it could be misleading as well, because there's so much big part of the population who is not following that stuff and it's not tweeting actually, might be following but not actually liking things. And but you can definitely understand maybe a trend, not really what will happen, but maybe the way the debate goes. And that is always critical for me to check and see.
Yeah. But I guess that is one of the dangers, if I can jump in for a second, of the social media world that we're now living in. So that whole concept of the filter bubble that probably everyone's heard of now. But if you have algorithms just feeding you things that they think you want to see rather than what's really going on, it's a pretty good golden rule in life as in journalism. Like, you should be reading things that challenge you. So if you're not actively seeking out people that you might disagree with or publications that you might disagree with, then you're at risk of making a mistake, whether it's going to just one particular opinion poll or one particular newspaper. You've got to have that diversity of sources to get a really good grip on the situation.
And don't overestimate social media use. Like, I mean, who's turning out? We see that consistently, that young people are not turning out in the numbers that more senior people do. Like, there was it's true in the election and exit polls, and it's also true in current polling. Like, for France, we see that like only 30% of under 30 aged people plan to go and vote, but like 60% of people over 60. And if you ask like, who's on social media, it's the other way around. So I think that has to be kept in mind as well.
And are you confident? Do you know enough about the individual polling practices and companies in Europe to say that they take proper account of the way people can be reached and the way they, communicate with people like polling companies? If someone is just calling people on a landline now, that's pretty out of date, isn't it?
I'm happy that hardly happens anymore. Like most companies have started to go on and do like a mix of online because it's cheaper and also cell phone polls. And that's also, once again, that's a good thing about a poll of polls, because if you have a party that, if you have one poll that only would take landline calls, which they don't do anymore, and only online polls, you reduce this systematic bias of like only using one method. So that's all exactly why one.
Is there something like that at work, Matthew, in betting markets? If one of your rivals suddenly changes the odds on a candidate, do you freak out and think, oh my God, what's happened? We've got to change it? Or do you sit tight and say, no, only when that Bavarian money comes in are we going to change Manfred Weber?
Ladbrokes is part of a very large betting ecosystem with lots of different platforms all around the world, with all sorts of people betting into them. And although the UK is probably ahead of the game in terms of, it's a very well-regulated country with very well-established operators, we've been doing this 60 years, we can't sort of stand outside of what the rest of the betting market thinks. Otherwise, you open up kind of what you call arbitrage opportunities, and people who weren't interested in the result but could see just there being some inefficiency in the market would close those prices up anyway. So our opinion makes up some part of the odds, but a relatively small part, I guess.
And have you ever been subject to that sort of industrial scale betting where someone tries to turn your market into like a financial market where you ever felt like, hang on, someone's trying to rig this?
Not really. I mean, it's hard for us to know the motivation of what people are doing when they're betting. We assume they're just betting because they think it's more they like to win the bet. I think there were some suggestions around the EU referendum again, that the kind of link between the financial markets, where if you were buying or selling sterling in the run-up to that referendum, you were essentially placing a bet on what the result was going to be, and how they related to the betting markets, and whether it was kind of tail wagging the dog situation where people were paying too much attention to what the bookies were saying. But again, we don't really have enough evidence to say whether that really happened or not.
I think we've got time for one more question, if there's someone who wants to jump in. No? People are almost in the mood for a drink, I think. Then I'll finish off on one sort of more topical thing. Have we got any sense, have you been running any bets on what's going on with the Brexit date or what's in the summit? And,
yes, lots of those.
What's going to be the impact on your lives when this summit produces a result tonight to each of you? Go ahead, Matthew.
Well, yeah, we've got a lot of bets on, well, in particular, whether there'll be a UK participation in these elections, which will create an awful lot of extra work for me, but I'm all in favour of it. You can bet on whether there'll be another referendum. That's only a 33% chance.
Is there like a kind of exit date bingo, like where you run the odds on when they'll actually leave?
No, we don't have a price on that. But you can bet on,
for instance... crazy! Come on,
you can, for instance, bet on when Theresa May will end being Prime Minister, what month, what year, when there'll be a general election, all sorts of options, yeah.
Okay, excellent. Eleni?
For me, I mean, it's depending on the extension, my life will change in terms of reporting. more months of the same saga. I mean, it's been, and it's very hard for the Greek audience because it's so technical, the talks. Very few people can follow it, and you always say, so there are two options, this and this, and then the next time you say two options, but they're different. So, I mean, people cannot really follow the story, and it will be hard to keep the interest.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll go back to the hotel and start rewriting my code for our algorithm with the UK. But yeah, I think just it's going to be a mess.
Okay. Well, if there's no final question, I'll give you one last shot. Any final questions in the audience? Forever hold your peace. Okay. Well, I want to thank, first of all of our panelists. Let's give them a round of applause. I obviously want to thank all of you and to everyone who is watching online. And finally, of course, our presenting partner, EGBA, the European Gaming and Betting Association. So thank you for bringing us all together and making the drinks happen outside as well. But before you stand up, my one last plea is fill out those evaluation forms. We're not like every other organization in Brussels. We actually want to know what you liked and didn't like about this event so we can do it better next time. And please join us for a drink outside now in the foyer. Thank you very much. Great, thanks.